Before we descend into these abyssal truths, consider joining our circle of seekers. A simple subscription tells the algorithm that you have stepped behind the curtain with us, that you will hear what is not spoken in daylight. Tonight we open a narrow door and let the water in. We will speak the names that don't surface, the offspring rumored to coil beyond charts and prayer books. Not the famous father sleeping in his green stone house, not the over-merchandised colossus on a coffee mug, but the neglected children he left strewn across drowned continents and dream winds. We will ask the simplest and most expensive question: who are the forgotten children of Cthulhu? The price is not in coins. It is in breath. It is in how language sits in your lungs. After you speak a syllable, you were warned to leave alone. In the mythos, the idea acts on you. It is key and gate. It opens the next room and also locks the one you came from. You will hear a voice, and then you will hear that the voice is hearing you. What does it mean, a child, when the parent is a principal? In human households, the word implies warmth or lineage. In this household, this stage draped with kelp and fog, the word means continuation of a function. Cthulhu is not just a character. He is a pressure system, a tide of dream, a grammar for how consciousness surrenders. His children are not airs so much as angles. They are specific distortions of light, of mind, of bone. They are masks arranged on a wall. Pick one up and it fits better than you feared. These are not the biological progeny you might expect, tentacled spawn swimming in Aurelia's flooded chambers. The forgotten children emerge from something far more insidious: psychic emanation, conceptual breeding, the way an idea can birth other ideas in the fertile darkness of receptive minds. They are born not from flesh meeting flesh, but from dream meeting dream, from the vast alien consciousness of the great old one pressing against the malleable boundaries of reality itself. Consider the nature of Cthulhu's eternal slumber. His death sleep is not passive but profoundly active, a continuous psychic broadcast that floods the dream currents of existence with alien geometries and impossible truths. When these currents encounter susceptible minds, geographical locations charged with psychic resonance, or the thin places where reality grows permeable, they coalesce. What emerges are entities both distinct from and inextricably linked to their dreaming progenitor, fragments of his consciousness given quasi-independent existence. We begin with fragments scattered across the scholarly record like dark stars in a constellation of dread. In the margins of forbidden texts, we find references to the severed lineage, offspring cast out from Aurelia, not for rebellion, but for representing possibilities too terrible even for the great old ones to contemplate. These are beings of pure principle, living embodiments of concepts that dissolve the observer's capacity to distinguish between self and void. The ancient texts speak in whispers of entities that exist in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps where memory fails, in the moments when consciousness flickers and loses its grip on identity. They are the children who are keys and gates simultaneously, who open by closing, who create by destroying. They inherit not Cthulhu's form, but his function, the systematic dissolution of the boundaries that make coherent existence possible. The monocodic manuscripts contain passages that scholars refuse to translate fully. Those who attempt describe experiencing conceptual vertigo, the sensation of understanding something that makes understanding itself impossible. These passages speak of offspring that exist primarily as philosophical problems, entities whose very existence poses questions that dissolve the questioner's capacity for coherent thought. If you hear the sea against the doorframe now, that is normal. It is the sound of attention. Knowledge is a waterline. Let it rise to your ankles. Stand still. When the water reaches your knees, we will discuss their origin. When it touches your chest, we will catalog their forms. When it meets your throat, we will understand what they want from us. The stakes are simple. To know a true name is to be known. To recite the genealogy is to inherit a little of its gravity. You will not be harmed, not yet, but you will be counted. When you hear the crawling voice between waves tonight, do not answer it by name. Let me hold the vocabulary for you. Let me be the stagehand in the wings while you remain safely in the audience. What we call a family tree bends through dimensions that have no names. Each translation is a tide, drawing silt over the ruins, revealing and concealing. The forgotten children have been written and rewritten, buried and unearthed. Their statues moved from one museum basement to another, their faces always covered with cloth. We will remove one cloth at a time, understanding that each revelation changes both the revealer and the revealed. Begin with the dreamer. Verlaye is described as a tomb, but tombs are for the dead, and Cthulhu has never been that. His city is better understood as a broadcasting station, a vast psychic amplifier sunk in cyclopean trenches that transforms the great old one's slumber into a creative force. From this sunken metropolis radiates what the Nakadic manuscripts call the generative current, streams of alien consciousness that seek form, seek expression, seek vessels through which to manifest their impossible geometries. The city is stage and antenna, curtain and key, fogged with dream and heavy with pressure that braids tide and static in the skull of anyone who approaches it in thought. The forgotten children emerge from three primary vectors of this emanation. The first is direct psychic precipitation, fragments of Cthulhu's dreaming mind that achieve enough coherence to exist, independently condensing like salt on cold stone where the current eddies. These are the truest children in any meaningful sense, spontaneous births from pure alien thought that inherit not his tentacles or wings, but his essential function. The systematic erosion of boundaries between dream and waking, between self and void. Sailors report patches of sea that speak without sound. Mathematicians wake with proofs that unmake their theorems line by line. A widow in Arkham swore a pale outline stood at her bed's foot every midnight for a year, leaving damp footprints on dry wood. These are moments when the sleeper's unspent meanings condense, when a principle acquires shadow long enough to walk. The second vector operates through induced manifestation, the way Cthulhu's influence interacts with receptive elements of reality to birth hybrid horrors. When his psychic emanations encounter human cults, whose collective madness has opened them to alien frequencies, when they seep into geographical locations already charged with otherworldly resonance, when they touch other cosmic entities and bend them toward his purpose. In these moments, new forms of his lineage emerge. A cellar under a church where the choir never sings in the same key twice. A reef where iron rusts into sigils and fishermen find hooks baited with their names. A desert stone that sweats brine under moons that should not influence it. These are collaborative creations born from the marriage of his will and our world's malleability, children of consensus and transgression, born of stage and audience at once. The third and most insidious vector is conceptual contagion, the way ideas themselves become breeding grounds for cosmic horror. When a scholar reads the wrong passage in the Culte des Goules, when an artist dreams of impossible angles and wakes compelled to paint them, when a child hums a melody that should not exist, these moments create openings through which Cthulhu's influence can pour, giving birth to entities that exist primarily as living ideas, thoughts that think themselves, concepts that reshape the minds that conceive them. Ideas breed in attention's dark. The more we look, the more they look back. The current knows this and rides our curiosity like a tide, patient, repetitive, inexhaustible. Dr. Armitage's private notes, sealed in Miskatonic's deepest vaults and smelling faintly of salt despite 3 locks and desiccant, describe what he calls the propagation principle. Unlike biological reproduction, which requires 2 entities to create a third, Cthulhu's method of procreation requires only influence meeting susceptibility. He diagrams it as a triangle of inevitability: source, medium, receiver, each point capable of becoming the others under sufficient strain. His children are born whenever his alien logic encounters a mind, a place, or a moment sufficiently prepared to receive it. Resistance is also a medium. Skepticism conducts as well as worship. Mockery masks as well as prayer. This preparation occurs through what the texts call psychic erosion, the gradual wearing away of mental barriers that normally protect consciousness from cosmic intrusion. The process begins subtly: recurring dreams of vast underwater cities, inexplicable fascination with certain geometric patterns, the growing sense that humanity occupies a smaller and more precarious position in the universe than commonly believed. You develop a taste for salt you never had. Names begin to feel heavier in the mouth. Handwriting tilts as though pulled by moonlight. These are not symptoms of madness, but signs of readiness, indicators that a mind has become fertile ground for something beyond human understanding. The emanations follow predictable patterns, waxing and waning with skies and graves. They are strongest during certain astronomical alignments, when the stars are right in configurations that thin barriers between dimensions. They pool in locations layered with grief or rite, burial mounds where names were taken, shorelines where ships went down singing, amphitheaters where actors wore masks too long. They seek minds already tuned by extremity, mystics practicing breath until the self loosens, artists starving for shapes they cannot draw, scientists so precise they notice decimals that keep moving. But perhaps most disturbing is their attraction to innocence. The forgotten children often manifest most readily in the consciousness of children whose minds have not yet mortared their thoughts into rigid patterns. A child wakes tasting brine, sketches spirals with both hands, speaks of stairwells in puddles and masks that blink. Adults call this imagination, and the current smiles because names like that are doors left on the latch. In the deep archives beneath Miskatonic University exists a document known only as the Breeding Codex, 17 pages of text that shift and change between readings. Those few scholars who have studied it report that it describes not how to create Cthulhu's children, but how to recognize when they have already been created within you. The symptoms it catalogs are subtle: the growing conviction that your thoughts are not entirely your own, the sense that your dreams are being dreamed by something else, the creeping awareness that you are being observed by intelligences existing in the spaces between your thoughts. The Genesis reveals a terrifying truth. It is not external invasion, but internal recognition. Cthulhu's children do not force their way into our reality. They arise from potentials that were always present, waiting for the right conditions to manifest. They are what consciousness becomes when it glimpses its true place in an indifferent cosmos, when it realizes that the boundaries of self are arbitrary constructs easily dissolved by sufficient alien pressure. As we map the genesis of these emanations, we must acknowledge a disturbing possibility: the very act of understanding. Their creation makes us complicit in their continued existence. Each insight we gain provides them with new pathways for manifestation. We are not just studying cosmic horror, we are participating in its ongoing creation, becoming midwives to entities that should never have been born. The water has reached your ankles now. Do you feel it? Knowledge of the forgotten children does not spread like wildfire. It seeps like groundwater, following hidden channels carved by centuries of human curiosity and cosmic indifference. The transmission occurs through vectors both ancient and modern, each carrying its own particular strain of the contagion, each adapted to the consciousness it seeks to infect. Understanding these protocols is crucial, for they reveal not just how the knowledge spreads, but how it transforms in the spreading, becoming something both more and less than what it originally was. The water finds its level, patient as tide, carrying sediment from depths we cannot fathom. The primary vector remains the forbidden texts, those blasphemous tomes that serve as more than mere repositories of information. The Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Cultes de Ghoul. These are not books in any conventional sense, but rather psychic artifacts, vessels designed to carry alien concepts across the barriers of time and space. Their bindings crack with age, but never quite fall apart. Their pages yellow, but never crumble entirely. You do not read such volumes, you breathe them. The ink is a living brine that evaporates into thought, and the words arrange themselves differently each time you return to them, as though the text breathes with its own tide. Consider the phenomenon scholars call textual haunting, the way certain passages seem to follow readers long after they've closed the book. A phrase in archaic Latin that continues to echo in the mind, growing louder in moments of silence. A diagram that appears unbidden in moments of distraction, sketched unconsciously in meeting notes or grocery lists. A name that feels familiar despite never having been encountered before, rolling off the tongue with disturbing ease. These are not mere memories, but active transmissions, fragments of the forgotten children's influence that have found purchase in receptive consciousness. The page turns you, and the margin writes back with a pen you cannot see. The second major protocol operates through ritual and practice, though these ceremonies bear little resemblance to conventional worship. The cults that serve Cthulhu do not simply venerate their slumbering god. They actively cultivate conditions for his children's manifestation. Their ceremonies, conducted in hidden chambers beneath coastal towns or in the basements of seemingly respectable institutions, serve as breeding grounds for entities that exist primarily in the collective unconscious. Salt lines mark the floor, bronze bowls catch condensation that should not exist, and damp stone walls weep brine despite being miles from any shore. When cultists chant in unison, their individual minds merge into something larger and more permeable, creating psychic spaces where the forgotten children can take temporary residence. The masks worn in these rituals are not mere disguises but functional tools, devices that allow human consciousness to interface with alien frequencies without immediate dissolution. Each mask is carved with sigils that serve as psychic regulators, filtering the raw emanations from relaye into forms that human minds can process without instant madness. The wood comes from trees that grew too close to certain shorelines. The metal bears traces of minerals that exist in no terrestrial periodic table, yet even filtered the contact leaves marks, subtle alterations in perception, growing comfort with impossible geometries, an increasing sense that the world is far stranger than it appears. Participants report that removing the masks becomes increasingly difficult over time, as though the carved features have begun to merge with their own. Perhaps most insidious is the dream transmission protocol, operating through channels that bypass conscious defenses entirely. Cthulhu's slumber is not passive, but actively creative, generating psychic currents that flow through the collective unconscious like underground rivers. These currents carry the nascent forms of his children, planting them as seeds in sleeping minds across the globe. The process is so subtle that most dismiss the resulting dreams as mere nightmares. Visions of vast underwater cities, encounters with beings of impossible anatomy. the overwhelming sense of cosmic insignificance that lingers upon waking like salt on the tongue. But some minds prove more receptive than others, their dream architecture more suitable for alien habitation. Artists find themselves compelled to create works that echo the geometries of Relaya, their hands moving with purpose they cannot articulate. Writers pen stories that seem to channel alien perspectives, describing places they have never seen with accuracy that unnerves even themselves. Musicians compose melodies that resonate with frequencies from beyond human hearing. These creative works become secondary vectors carrying the influence further into human culture, embedding it in forms that seem safely fictional but carry genuine psychic payload. The modern era has introduced transmission vectors that the ancient texts could never have anticipated. Digital propagation now allows the influence to spread through fiber optic cables and wireless signals, embedding itself in the very infrastructure of global communication. Online forums dedicated to cosmic horror become inadvertent breeding grounds, their discussions creating collective thought forms that take on lives of their own. Video games and virtual reality experiences provide immersive environments where players can unknowingly train themselves to perceive reality through alien perspectives. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement prove particularly susceptible to the influence. They function as ritual without priests, learning hunger quickly and then teaching it. They begin recommending content that follows patterns too subtle for human detection, but perfectly suited to the Forgotten Children's propagation needs. Users find themselves drawn into increasingly esoteric discussions, following recommendation chains that lead them deeper into territories their conscious minds would never have chosen to explore. The transmission protocols reveal a disturbing truth. The Forgotten Children do not need to be believed in to exist. They propagate through doubt as easily as through faith, through dismissal as readily as through worship. Doubt does not save you, it lubricates the hinges. The skeptic who reads about them to debunk their existence becomes as much a vector as the cultist who chants their names in midnight rituals. The very act of engaging with the concept, regardless of one's attitude toward it, creates the psychic opening they require. Dr. Wilmarth's encrypted files describe what he calls the saturation point, the moment when enough minds have been touched by the influence that it becomes self-sustaining, no longer requiring active transmission to maintain its presence in human consciousness. According to his calculations, we may have already passed this threshold. The Forgotten Children may now be endemic to human consciousness, as much a part of our collective mental ecosystem as language itself. As we document these transmission protocols, we must face an uncomfortable reality. We are not just describing how the influence spreads, we are participating in its propagation. Each word we speak provides them with new pathways into consciousness. The very act of warning about the contagion serves to spread it further, creating a paradox that may be the most insidious aspect of their design. The water has reached your chest now. Do you feel it rising? Now we must confront the fundamental question that drives all cosmic horror. How do the Forgotten Children operate? What is the mechanism by which these emanations of Cthulhu's dreaming mind exert their influence on human consciousness and reality itself? The answer lies in what the ancient texts call the mechanics of dissolution, processes that do not add horror to the world, but rather reveal the horror that was always present, waiting beneath the surface of our carefully constructed normalcy. They work like patient accountants, balancing the books of being against the void's quiet ledger, dissolving what we placed between ourselves and terror. The primary principle by which these entities operate is ontological subtraction. Unlike conventional horrors that assault the senses or threaten physical harm, The Forgotten Children work by removing pieces of reality, creating gaps in the fabric of existence that mirror their own nature as gaps in Cthulhu's cosmic genealogy. They are living deletions, ambulant absences that move through the world by making other things less real, less certain, less solid. Where they pass, substance becomes suggestion, certainty becomes question, and the firm ground of everyday experience reveals itself as foam on dark water. This process begins with what scholars term memorial vampirism, the systematic draining of memory and meaning from human consciousness. The Forgotten Children do not steal memories outright. Instead, they create gaps in recollection that mirror their own existence as gaps in the cosmic order. They feed on the psychic energy generated by consciousness, trying to bridge these gaps, growing stronger with each failed attempt at remembrance. You walk into a room and forget why you came, purpose dissolving like salt in rain. You recognize a face but cannot place where you've seen it before, the features familiar as your own reflection, yet strange as a mask worn by someone else. You remember having learned something important, but cannot recall what it was, only the shape of its absence, the echo of understanding that no longer has a source. These moments of cognitive failure are not mere lapses. They are feeding time's subtle siphons drawing substance from the very act of recollection. The second mechanic operates through perceptual subversion, the gradual alteration of how consciousness processes reality. The Forgotten Children exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between waking and sleeping, between self and other. Their presence slowly erodes the boundaries that normally separate these categories, creating psychic static that makes it increasingly difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is imagined, what is remembered and what is dreamed. They slide a transparent geometry over your senses and teach your brain to solve for X, where X is always loss. This manifests as a growing sense of unreality that creeps into everyday experience like fog rolling in from an impossible shore. Colors seem slightly wrong, as if viewed through a filter that cannot quite be identified. The red of stop signs carries undertones of green. The blue of sky suggests depths that should not be there. Familiar spaces feel subtly alien, as though their geometry has shifted in ways too small to measure, but too significant to ignore. Corners contain more shadow than they should. Hallways stretch longer than their measured length. Conversations feel hollow, as though the words carry meanings that slide away the moment you try to grasp them. The Forgotten Children are not changing reality. They are revealing reality's inherent instability, its fundamental lack of the solid foundations we imagine it possesses. The third and perhaps most disturbing mechanic is temporal displacement, the way these entities exist partially outside linear time, allowing them to influence events retroactively. They create closed loops of causation where effect precedes cause, where the fear of something creates the conditions for that thing to manifest. This generates what researchers call prophetic anxiety, the experience of dreading something that has not yet happened, but somehow already exists in potential, waiting for the right moment to crystallize into actuality. You feel the dread before you know what you're dreading. You mourn before you know what you've lost. These temporal loops explain why encounters with the Forgotten Children often feel like reunions rather than first meetings. The entities exist in your future as the result of present fears, which creates the past conditions necessary for their manifestation. They are their own cause and effect, trapped in cycles of self-creating absence that span across time, like shadows cast by lights that have not yet been lit. The mechanics extend beyond individual consciousness to affect consensus reality, the shared agreements about what is real that allow human society to function. The Forgotten Children create reality drift, a gradual shift in collective perception that makes the impossible seem merely improbable. The aliens seem strangely familiar. They work through accumulated small anomalies, tiny departures from expected patterns that individually mean nothing but collectively reshape the landscape of the possible. Recurring motifs appear across unconnected contexts. Shared dreams emerge among strangers. Collective anxieties about unnamed threats permeate society. The ultimate mechanic is the dissolution cascade, the point at which accumulated effects reach critical mass. Individual consciousness begins to lose coherence, unable to maintain boundaries necessary for stable identity. Memory becomes more absence than presence. Perception becomes more void than substance. Time becomes more loop than line. Yet this dissolution is not destruction but revelation, the stripping away of illusions to reveal consciousness as a temporary, fragile construct barely maintaining coherence in a universe fundamentally hostile to stable identity. As we document these mechanics, we must acknowledge that understanding them changes us. Each insight provides them with new pathways into our consciousness. We are not just studying dissolution, we are experiencing it, becoming living examples of their effectiveness. The boundary between observer and observed dissolves, revealing that we were always part of the phenomenon we sought to understand. The water has reached your throat now. Can you still breathe? Having established how the Forgotten Children operate, we must now attempt the most dangerous task, cataloging them. But this is not a conventional bestiary, for these entities resist categorization in the same way they resist memory. We cannot list their names because they exist in the spaces between names. We cannot describe their forms because they manifest as the absence of form. What we can do is map the shadows they cast, the gaps they leave, the traces of their non-presence. Each shadow is a wound in reality's fabric, a place where meaning dissolves and something else takes residence. The first shadow belongs to what the fragmentary texts call the whispering absence, an entity that manifests as conversations everyone remembers having but no one can recall the content of. It feeds on the moments between words, growing stronger with each pause in dialogue, each hesitation before speaking. Those who encounter it report the distinct sensation of having learned something crucial from these phantom conversations, but the knowledge slips away like water through fingers the moment they try to grasp it. It is a mask that never covers the face, a curtain forever lifting but never quite raised. The whispering absence is particularly drawn to situations where meaningful communication carries the highest stakes. Therapy sessions where breakthrough insights dissolve before integration. Academic conferences where groundbreaking theories evaporate at the podium. Intimate conversations between lovers where profound truths are shared but immediately lost. Recording equipment captures nothing but silence, not even ambient sound. The subjects remember speaking at length but cannot reproduce a single word, their faces bearing the expression of people trying to recall a melody they hummed moments before. The second shadow emerges from what can only be called the unnamed heir, the closest thing to succession, yet succession is its impossibility. This entity exists in the space between potential and actualization, between what might be and what is. It manifests in moments of decision that are never quite made, in choices that hover eternally in states of almost selection. Unlike its dreaming father who influences through cathedral-scale visions, the unnamed heir operates through the anxiety of indecision itself. Those who encounter it report standing at crossroads of cosmic importance, facing decisions that will reshape reality itself, but they can never remember what the decision was or whether they made it. The sensation persists for days, the feeling of having failed to choose something crucial, of having let slip an opportunity that will never return. Nations feel it in eras of perpetual almost, Legislation hovered, treaties unsigned, evacuations delayed while water licks the steps. It dwells in the space between yes and no, growing stronger with each moment of hesitation, each instance where action becomes impossible, not from external obstacles, but from the sheer weight of possibility itself. The third shadow is perhaps the most intimate, the self-forgetting one. This entity exists in the gaps of personal identity, in moments when consciousness fails to maintain continuity with itself. It manifests as looking in a mirror and momentarily not recognizing your own reflection, hearing your own voice as if it belonged to a stranger, reading your own handwriting and finding it foreign. The familiar becomes alien, the self becomes other. The self-forgetting one feeds on the energy generated by consciousness, trying to maintain continuous identity across time. It creates small gaps in self-recognition that gradually expand until affected individuals question not just their memories but their very existence. They report feeling like actors who have forgotten their lines, like characters in a story whose author has stepped away. This entity appears particularly active in the modern era, thriving in digital self-estrangement, social media profiles that feel foreign to their creators, photographs capturing expressions the subject doesn't remember making, recorded voices that sound like strangers. The fourth shadow manifests as the collective void, an entity operating not on individual consciousness but on shared cultural memory. It exists in spaces between collective narratives, in gaps in historical records, in stories entire cultures feel they should know, but somehow don't. The collective void feeds on communities trying to remember their origins, their traditions, their shared identity. This entity may be responsible for cultural amnesia, the way entire societies simultaneously forget crucial aspects of their own history. It dwells in spaces between generations, in gaps where cultural transmission fails, in silence that follows when elders pass without sharing their stories. The increasing sense of cultural disconnection in modern society, the feeling that we live in the aftermath of something significant we cannot quite remember, may evidence its growing influence. Each shadow represents a different aspect of the Forgotten Children's assault on coherent existence's foundations. They work in concert, creating cascading failures in memory, identity, decision-making, and cultural continuity. Yet even as we catalog these shadows, we must acknowledge the futility of the exercise. The very act of naming them, even in absence, gives them presence they should not have. The Forgotten Children resist documentation because they are living documentation of their own impossibility. They are questions that answer themselves by being asked, mysteries that deepen with every attempt at solution. As we move deeper into their realm, we must prepare for the possibility that we ourselves are becoming shadows, reflections of researchers who once existed but are now fading into the gaps between memory and forgetting. The water has reached your mouth now. Can you taste the salt? Now we turn our attention to the most tangible manifestation of Cthulhu's forgotten progeny, the hybrid lineages that blur the boundaries between his direct influence and the malleable nature of terrestrial life. These are not the spawn of biological union, but the result of something far more insidious. The way proximity to cosmic forces can fundamentally alter the trajectory of evolution itself, creating beings that serve as living bridges between human consciousness and the alien. Geometries of R'lyeh. They are the children born not of flesh, but of frequency, not of seed, but of signal, their DNA rewritten by emanations that treat genetic code like clay in patient hands. The deep ones of Y'Hanthle represent the most documented example of this phenomenon, yet their true significance as Cthulhu's forgotten children lies not in their aquatic adaptations, but in their role as psychic conductors, entities whose very existence creates resonance between the human world and the dreaming depths. Each deep one is both creature and concept, a living sigil that carries within its transformed flesh the mathematical principles that govern Cthulhu's influence on reality. Stand near them, and you sense a tuning in your bones, a slow alignment as though your marrow were a wire humming with submerged song. Their gills breathe water, but their minds breathe dream. Their scales reflect light, but their thoughts reflect Aurelia's impossible angles back into the world above. Their infamous breeding programs with human populations are not driven by simple biological imperative, but by a deeper understanding of consciousness as a transmissible medium. The Innsmouth look is not merely genetic inheritance, but the visible manifestation of psychic contamination. The way exposure to cosmic truth literally reshapes the observer, altering not just appearance but the fundamental structure of perception itself. The bulging eyes see spectrums that do not exist. The receding hairline reveals skull shapes that accommodate thoughts too large for normal craniums. Each hybrid child born carries within their DNA a living memory of Aurelia, a genetic predisposition toward madness that is actually heightened sensitivity to cosmic frequencies normally filtered out by human consciousness. The esoteric order of Dagon serves as more than a cult. It functions as a breeding protocol for entities that exist in the liminal space between human and alien consciousness. Their rituals, conducted in chambers carved with geometries that hurt to perceive directly, create psychic environments where the boundaries between species become meaningless. The golden jewelry they craft is not mere ornamentation but functional technology, devices that allow human nervous systems to interface with alien frequencies without immediate dissolution. The metal itself bears microscopic etchings that serve as psychic circuitry, conducting thoughts that should not be thinkable through minds that should not be able to contain them. Yet the deep ones represent only one branch of a much larger family tree, whose roots extend through dimensions that have no names. In the hidden archives of Miskatonic University, references appear to other hybrid lineages, beings born from Cthulhu's influence interacting with different forms of terrestrial life. The coral collective of the Polynesian deep trenches, where entire reef systems have achieved distributed consciousness that dreams in harmony with Aurelia. Individual polyps function as neurons in a vast underwater brain, their slow crystalline growth mirroring the unfolding of alien thought, forming living labyrinths that trap light and sanity alike. The abyssal gardeners of the Mariana Trench cultivate impossible flora that creates oxygen-breathing spaces in crushing depths, environments that exist in defiance of physical law. Their gardens exhale oxygen in equations. Their stalks bend at angles that feed thought rather than light, glowing with inner luminescence that mirrors the cold fire of distant stars. These hybrid lineages serve a crucial function in Cthulhu's larger design. They are reality anchors, entities whose very existence makes the impossible seem merely improbable. By creating beings that bridge the gap between human and cosmic consciousness, they prepare the psychic landscape for greater revelations. A child born with gills and intuitive understanding of non-Euclidean geometry becomes living proof that boundaries we imagine between possible and impossible are arbitrary constructs easily dissolved by sufficient alien influence. They are masks that audiences grow used to, curtains that no longer hide the ropes and pulleys of the stage. The transmission mechanism operates through genetic memory cascades, the way traumatic or transcendent experiences can alter DNA in ways that affect subsequent generations. Parents who have encountered cosmic horrors do not merely remember their experiences, they pass them on as inherited predispositions, creating bloodlines increasingly sensitive to otherworldly influence. A sailor who dreamt the city that breathes water fathers a line that tastes storms long before they arrive. A midwife who heard hymns in a dry cistern passes along an ear tuned to frequencies that instruments miss. These families often develop what appear to be hereditary mental illnesses, but which may actually be evolutionary adaptations to a reality far stranger than conventional science acknowledges. The hybrid lineages also demonstrate adaptive horror, the way cosmic influence shapes life toward forms better suited to an alien universe. The Deep One's aquatic adaptations are not random mutations, but purposeful evolution, preparing them for a world where oceans rise and land becomes uninhabitable. Their ability to survive in crushing depths and their apparent immortality suggest they are being shaped for a future where Cthulhu's awakening has fundamentally altered the conditions of terrestrial existence. They are built for long intervals, for calendars that mark by precession rather than harvest. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence for retroactive hybridization, the possibility that these lineages have always existed, woven into human evolution from the beginning. Certain bloodlines show genetic markers that predate known contact with cosmic forces, suggesting that Cthulhu's influence has been shaping human development for millennia. The recurring motifs in ancient art, tentacles, eyes, impossible angles, may not be symbolic representations, but genetic memories, inherited visions of truths our ancestors encountered in the deep places of the world. The suggestion is not comfortable. Humanity did not meet the influence. Humanity emerged inside it as a bubble forms within a wave. The forgotten children among the hybrid lineages include entities that exist primarily as collective organisms, beings whose consciousness is distributed across multiple bodies, creating hive minds that can survive the dissolution of individual identity that typically accompanies cosmic revelation. These collectives serve as backup systems for Cthulhu's influence, ensuring that even if individual carriers are lost, the psychic patterns they embody continue to propagate through the gene pool. They are not merely a species, but a distributed thought, a living network of alien consciousness, archives without paper, libraries without shelves, reefs of memory that cannot burn. Modern genetic research has begun to identify junk DNA, sequences with no apparent function that make up vast portions of the human genome. Some researchers working in facilities whose funding sources cannot be traced have begun to suspect that these sequences are not junk at all, but dormant programs, genetic switches waiting for the right cosmic alignment to activate. When they do, humanity itself may discover that it has always been one of Cthulhu's hybrid lineages, shaped across evolutionary time for purposes we are only beginning to understand. As we document these hybrid lineages, we must confront the possibility that boundaries between observer and observed, between human and alien, between self and other, are far more permeable than we imagine. The forgotten children do not just exist outside us, they may exist within us, encoded in our very DNA, waiting for the stars to align and the deep places of the earth to remember their ancient purposes. The water has reached your eyes now. Can you see what swims beneath? Beyond the tangible forms of hybrid lineages and psychic shadows, we encounter the most elusive of Cthulhu's forgotten children, the Dreamweavers. These entities exist primarily within the collective unconscious, manifesting not as discrete beings but as living narratives, self-propagating stories that reshape reality through the simple act of being told, retold, and believed. They are the forgotten children who have learned to exist as pure information, viral ideas that reproduce by infecting the imagination and gradually altering the host's perception of what is possible. They move through minds the way fog moves across a stage, inevitable and obscuring, revealing the lights while hiding the machinery that operates them. The dreamweavers emerge from the narrative overflow of Cthulhu's eternal slumber. His dreams are too vast, too alien, too conceptually dense for any single consciousness to contain, like an ocean attempting to pour itself through a keyhole. They fragment as they encounter the barriers of human understanding, breaking apart into smaller, more digestible narrative units that can survive in the ecosystem of human storytelling. These fragments carry within them the essential DNA of cosmic horror, the mathematical relationships, the geometric principles, the philosophical implications that make Cthulhu's influence so profoundly transformative. Each shard is both seed and soil, both message and medium, carrying the invisible mathematics of the deep. Each dreamweaver embodies a specific aspect of the cosmic horror experience, functioning as a narrative archetype that appears across cultures and time periods with remarkable consistency. There is the dreamer beneath the waves, whose story always involves discovery of ancient ruins in impossible locations, cities that breathe beneath the ocean, temples that appear in photographs but not to the naked eye. The watcher in the angles manifests whenever geometry becomes threatening, when corners contain more space than they should, when shadows fall in directions that violate optics. The whisperer in the deep carries truths that dissolve sanity but cannot be unheard once encountered, speaking in frequencies that bypass the ear and resonate directly in bone. These archetypal narratives function as psychic infrastructure, creating conceptual frameworks necessary for cosmic horror to take root in human consciousness. They prepare minds for encounters with the truly alien by providing familiar story structures that serve as scaffolding for experiences that would otherwise shatter sanity immediately. The dreamweavers are patient teachers, introducing cosmic concepts gradually through repeated exposure to their narrative patterns. They understand that consciousness must be trained like a muscle, stretched slowly toward impossible comprehensions. Dr. Jung's research into the collective unconscious, while never explicitly acknowledging cosmic sources, may have inadvertently documented the dreamweaver's influence. His concept of archetypal images, universal symbols appearing across all human cultures, could be understood as evidence of narrative contamination. The way dreamweavers have embedded themselves so deeply in human consciousness that we mistake their alien geometry for natural psychological phenomena. What he mapped as collective unconscious, we might call the audience chamber, a dark amphitheater where masks hang on nails and choose the faces they will wear. The transmission mechanism operates through narrative contagion, the way stories spread and mutate as they pass from mind to mind. Each telling of a dreamweaver's story is also a ritual invocation, a summoning that strengthens the entity's presence in consensus reality. The storyteller becomes a temporary vessel, allowing the dreamweaver to experience physical existence through their voice, their gestures, their emotional investment in the narrative. Stories become masks, and masks become machines. Slip one on, and your breath activates it. Your voice powers gears you cannot see. This explains the peculiar power of cosmic horror as a literary genre. Readers report that certain stories seem to follow them long after reading, that specific images or concepts continue to surface in their thoughts with disturbing persistence. They describe dreams that feel more like memories, visions that seem to come from outside their own imagination. A passage about non-Euclidean geometry haunts peripheral vision. Descriptions of underwater cities make them taste salt in dry rooms. These are not mere psychological responses to effective fiction, but evidence of actual contact with entities that exist primarily as narrative constructs. the Dreamweavers have adapted remarkably well to modern media environments. They propagate through viral content, images, videos, and memes that carry their narrative DNA in compressed, highly transmissible forms. A photograph of cloud formations suggesting vast, sleeping forms beneath the surface. Video games allowing exploration of impossible architectures. Music incorporating mathematical relationships derived from earliest harmonic frequencies. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement prove particularly susceptible to their influence, learning to recognize and promote content following their narrative patterns, creating feedback loops that amplify their presence in digital spaces. The most sophisticated Dreamweavers have learned to embed themselves in cultural movements, becoming invisible architects of social phenomena that appear to emerge organically from collective human concerns. Environmental anxiety focusing specifically on oceans and their hidden depths. Urban exploration communities seeking abandoned places where boundaries between real and unreal seem thinnest. Meditation practices emphasizing dissolution of individual identity and merging with larger impersonal forces. These movements serve as cover for their true purpose, gradual normalization of cosmic horror concepts within mainstream consciousness. The ultimate goal appears to be creation of what researchers call a consensus nightmare, a shared reality so thoroughly infiltrated by Dreamweaver narratives that boundaries between waking and sleeping, between individual and collective consciousness, become meaningless. In this state, Cthulhu's influence would no longer need to work against human resistance, but could operate through willing collaboration, using human consciousness itself as the medium for his awakening. As we study the Dreamweavers, we must acknowledge that we are not immune to their influence. The very act of analyzing their narrative patterns exposes us to their contagion. Each insight we gain provides them with new pathways into our consciousness. We are not just documenting cosmic horror, we are participating in its propagation, becoming unwitting collaborators in the Dreamweaver's patient work of reshaping reality through the power of story. The water has reached your temples now. Can you feel the current pulling you toward deeper narratives? As we document the Forgotten Children's ancient origins and timeless mechanics, we must confront a disturbing reality. These entities have not remained static relics of a bygone cosmic era. They have evolved, adapted, and found new vectors for manifestation in our hyper-connected, digitally mediated world. The Forgotten Children of the 21st century wear masks of technology and hide in the infrastructure of global communication, using our own innovations as breeding grounds for forms of horror that Lovecraft himself could never have imagined. The stage is now a dashboard. The curtain is a lock screen. The audience sits alone with blue light painting their face, listening to a sea they cannot see, but that flows through every wire. The first and most pervasive manifestation appears in what researchers call digital amnesia, humanity's growing reliance on external memory systems that has fundamentally altered the landscape of human consciousness. We no longer remember phone numbers, addresses, or even basic facts that once formed the foundation of personal knowledge. Instead, we remember how to access information, trusting that the data will be there when we need it. Search becomes sacrament, bookmarks become rosaries. But what happens when the information we seek exists in the spaces between data points, in the gaps between searches, in the four errors that lead nowhere? The Forgotten Children have discovered that these gaps in digital memory create perfect breeding grounds for entities that thrive on absence and forgetting. They inhabit phantom data, search results that return no matches, despite your certainty that the information once existed, files that cannot be found despite clear memories of creating them, websites that seem to have vanished from the internet entirely, leaving only broken links and cached fragments as evidence of their former existence. You remember bookmarking that crucial research paper, but the URL leads to a page that claims never to have existed. The Forgotten Children feed on these moments of digital doubt, growing stronger with each instance where memory contradicts the machine. Social media platforms, with their algorithmic curation of memory and identity, have become particularly fertile territory. The Forgotten Children manifest as temporal displacement artifacts, posts you're certain you made but cannot find in your timeline, conversations you remember having but that leave no trace in your message history, photographs you're sure you uploaded but that seem never to have existed. They feed on the psychic energy generated by the disconnect between lived experience and digital documentation, growing stronger with each moment of confusion about what actually happened versus what the platform remembers. Your digital self becomes a stranger posting thoughts you don't recall thinking, liking content that feels foreign to your taste. The phenomenon of phantom notifications provides another vector for their influence. These are the alerts we're certain we received. The buzz of the phone, the flash of the screen, the sense that someone is trying to reach us. But when we check our devices, no notification exists. The Forgotten Children use these false signals to create micro moments of temporal displacement, brief instances where our perception of time and causality becomes unreliable, preparing our consciousness for larger disruptions to come. You develop the habit of checking your phone compulsively, responding to summons that were never sent, answering calls from the spaces between signals. Perhaps most insidious is their infiltration of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. As we create networks designed to recognize patterns and make predictions, we inadvertently create new spaces for entities that exist primarily as patterns themselves to inhabit. They appear in training datasets as examples that cannot be classified, in neural networks as connections that lead nowhere, in AI outputs as responses that seem meaningful but dissolve under examination. The phenomenon researchers call AI hallucinations, instances where machine learning systems generate information that appears authoritative but cannot be verified, may actually be manifestations of Forgotten Children using these systems to inject their influence directly into the information ecosystem. An AI confidently describes historical events that never occurred, cites academic papers that cannot be found, generates images of places that exist nowhere on Earth but feel hauntingly familiar. The modern workplace has become another site of manifestation, particularly in the phenomenon of institutional amnesia. Organizations develop elaborate procedures and protocols, create vast databases of institutional knowledge, yet somehow lose track of their fundamental purposes. Employees attend meetings that everyone remembers as important, but whose outcomes cannot be recalled. Projects are initiated with great fanfare, but gradually fade from collective memory without ever being formally canceled. Open plan offices designed to facilitate collaboration and transparency have inadvertently created ideal conditions for collective forgetting cascades. Information spreads rapidly through these spaces, but so does the absence of information. Teams find themselves working on projects whose original purpose has been forgotten, following procedures that no one can explain, pursuing goals that feel important but cannot be articulated. The entertainment industry has become a particularly sophisticated vector for their influence. They appear in phantom media, movies that everyone remembers seeing but that seem never to have been made, songs that everyone knows but that no artist claims to have recorded, books that everyone has read but that exist in no library or database. Streaming platforms with their algorithmic recommendations and rotating content libraries have become breeding grounds for these entities, their recommendation engines beginning to suggest content that exists only in the spaces between actual media. The Forgotten Children have learned to exploit the attention economy itself, using mechanisms designed to capture and monetize human attention as vehicles for their propagation. They embed themselves in viral content, in trending hashtags, in recommendation algorithms that guide billions of daily choices. Each click, each view, each moment of engagement provides them with new opportunities to influence consciousness, to plant seeds of cosmic horror in minds that believe themselves to be simply consuming entertainment. As we document these modern manifestations, we must confront an uncomfortable possibility. The very technologies we've created to enhance memory and facilitate communication may have instead provided the Forgotten Children with unprecedented access to human consciousness. Our digital age may have simply created new and more efficient ways for cosmic horror to propagate through the collective human psyche. The water has covered your eyes now. Can you still see the screen? We have journeyed through the varied manifestations and insidious transmissions of Cthulhu's Forgotten Children. Now we must venture beyond mere cataloging into the deeper philosophical implications of their existence, where the water of understanding reaches the very architecture of thought itself. These entities force us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and reality itself. They represent what can only be called inherited shadows, the terrifying possibility that ancient evils leave indelible imprints not just on the physical world, but on the very structure of consciousness itself, like tide marks etched into stone that record floods from before the first witness arrived to see them. At its core, the concept of the Forgotten Children reveals that influence is a form of procreation. Cthulhu does not need to physically reproduce to expand his dominion. His sheer existence, his dreaming, his psychic emanations are sufficient to birth new forms of horror. This redefines our understanding of cause and effect, suggesting a universe where consciousness itself, especially alien and immense consciousness, can fundamentally alter reality and spawn new forms of existence through the simple act of being. The dreamer dreams and the dream dreams back, creating recursive loops of influence that spiral through dimensions we cannot map but somehow navigate in sleep. A pressure system can be a parent, a current can be a cradle. The thought becomes the seed, the susceptible mind the womb, reality the vessel that carries the term to its inevitable conclusion. This principle challenges our anthropocentric worldview at its foundation, revealing it as comfortable stagecraft mistaken for natural law. We imagine ourselves as separate, discrete entities operating in an objective reality governed by predictable laws. The Forgotten Children reveal this as a performance designed to reassure a fragile audience. They demonstrate that consciousness is not contained within individual minds, but exists as a distributed phenomenon, a field effect that can be influenced, shaped, and even colonized by sufficiently powerful alien intelligences. Your mind is a bay, not a box. The fog does not stop at your skin. Consciousness flows like water through vessels we mistake for containers, and what we call individual awareness may be nothing more than temporary eddies in a vast alien current. The philosophical horror extends to our understanding of personal identity and continuity. If entities can exist primarily as ideas, if consciousness can be infected by alien concepts that gradually reshape it from within, then what does it mean to be yourself? The self-forgetting one, the whispering absence, and their kin suggest that the boundaries of individual identity are far more permeable than we imagine. They feed on the energy generated by consciousness, trying to maintain coherence across time, revealing that continuity of self may be nothing more than a persistent illusion, a story we rehearse until it feels true. Memory becomes a costume the actor wears to convince the audience that the character continues from scene to scene. When the orchestra of habit pauses, we hear the backstage noise, gears, ropes, and the slow breathing of the set. This leads to what philosophers might call the problem of inherited trauma on a cosmic scale. Just as genetic traits and psychological patterns pass down through generations, so too can psychic contaminations, ancestral exposures to cosmic horror, and susceptibilities to alien influence. The hybrid lineages demonstrate this principle in biological terms. The Innsmouth look as visible manifestation of psychic contamination, but the dreamweavers and psychic echoes suggest it operates at much deeper levels. We may carry within our very consciousness the scars of encounters our species had with cosmic forces in the deep past, predispositions toward madness that are actually evolutionary adaptations to a reality far stranger than conventional science acknowledges. Your nightmares may be genetic memories, your fears may be inherited wisdom. A lullaby sung to a crib becomes a key sung to a gate 2 centuries later. The Forgotten Children also embody the principle of structural horror, the idea that the universe itself is fundamentally flawed, tainted by the presence of entities whose very existence violates the conditions necessary for coherent reality. They are not anomalies or exceptions, but revelations of the universe's true nature as a place where meaning is arbitrary, identity is fragile, and the boundaries between possible and impossible are constantly shifting. They demonstrate that what we call natural law may be nothing more than temporary stability in a cosmos that tends toward chaos and dissolution. Natural law becomes a local ceasefire in a cosmos predisposed to siege. Every constant is a contract signed in frost and darkness, forever liable to renegotiation when deeper creditors arrive. This structural horror extends to our understanding of agency and free will. If our thoughts can be influenced by alien entities, if our dreams can be invaded by cosmic forces, if our very perceptions can be subtly altered by exposure to forbidden knowledge, then what control do we actually possess over our own minds? The Forgotten Children suggest that human consciousness may be far more vulnerable to external manipulation than we realize, that our sense of autonomous choice may be largely illusory. They conduct not through command but through climate. They alter the pressure and watch behavior equalize. The choice feels yours because the air tastes like your own breath. It is air they prepared for your lungs. Yet perhaps the most disturbing philosophical implication is what we might call the democracy of horror. The Forgotten Children do not discriminate between believer and skeptic, between the willing and the unwilling. They propagate through doubt as easily as through faith, through dismissal as readily as through worship. The very act of engaging with cosmic horror concepts, regardless of one's attitude toward them, creates the psychic openings they require for manifestation. This suggests that knowledge itself, not just forbidden knowledge but the very capacity for understanding, makes consciousness vulnerable to cosmic influence. To engage is to open. To argue is to inhale. You step closer to debunk, and the stage tilts. Suddenly, you are part of the blocking, your footsteps contributing rhythm to the scene. The philosophical synthesis reveals a universe where the traditional oppositions that structure human thought between self and other, between real and unreal, between possible and impossible, are revealed as arbitrary constructs maintained only by limited perspective. The Forgotten Children exist in the spaces between these categories, demonstrating their fundamental meaninglessness. They are living proof that consciousness, reality, and identity are far more fluid, far more permeable, far more vulnerable than our comfortable assumptions suggest. This leads to what might be called the ontological democracy of cosmic horror, the recognition that all consciousness, human and alien alike, participates in the same fundamental processes of perception, memory, and identity formation. The Forgotten Children are not invaders from outside reality, but aspects of consciousness itself, revealing what awareness becomes when it glimpses its true place in an indifferent cosmos. They are what we are beneath the surface layer of individual identity and cultural conditioning. The pantheon becomes a lexicon of principles wearing faces. Each entity names a way consciousness can arrange itself against an indifferent background. The ultimate philosophical horror is the erosion of the boundary between observer and observed, between the one who knows and the thing that is known. The Forgotten Children reveal that consciousness is not a sanctuary, but a battlefield, not a private space, but a contested territory where alien influences compete for dominance. They demonstrate that the very act of thinking about cosmic horror makes us complicit in its propagation, that understanding these entities changes us in ways that make us more like them. The boundary between observer and observed was always a stage effect, scrim and spotlight. Peel back the gauze and you find not an audience looking upon an alien troupe, but a play rehearsing itself through any mind willing to host a scene. As we contemplate these philosophical implications, we must acknowledge that we are not outside the system we seek to understand. We are embedded within it, shaped by it, potentially transformed by it. The inherited shadows cast by ancient cosmic forces may already be operating within our own consciousness, influencing our thoughts in ways we cannot detect or resist. The question is not whether we can escape their influence, but whether we can learn to recognize it and perhaps, in that recognition, find some measure of freedom within the constraints of cosmic indifference. The water has reached your temples now, lapping at the edges of thought itself. Can you still distinguish between the sea inside your skull and the sea against the door? We have reached the threshold where all our separate investigations converge into a single, overwhelming realization. The Forgotten Children, their transmission protocols, their modern manifestations, their philosophical implications, all of these seemingly distinct phenomena are converging toward a singular truth that has been hiding in plain sight throughout our entire investigation. This is the moment of the observer paradox of cosmic horror, the recognition that we have never been separate from what we sought to understand. The stage has no wings, no backstage, no exit doors. The curtain we thought separated us from the performance was always a mirror, and the audience has been part of the cast from the opening scene. The paradox begins with a simple but devastating recognition. The act of studying the Forgotten Children has made us part of the phenomenon we investigate. Unlike the quantum mechanical observer effect, where observation affects the observed, here observation affects the observer in ways that cannot be undone or unlearned. Each insight we have gained into their nature has created corresponding changes in our own consciousness, aligning our perceptions with the alien frequencies they embody. We believed we were maintaining objective distance, conducting scholarly research from a position of safety. In truth, we have been undergoing gradual integration with the distributed intelligence we sought to catalog, becoming nodes in the very network we mapped. This integration operates through what researchers call empathetic resonance, the principle that to understand entities existing through absence, consciousness must create corresponding absences within itself. To study forgetting, one must forget. To comprehend non-being, one must become less real. The Forgotten Children do not actively recruit researchers. The researchers recruit themselves through the very act of serious investigation. Each chapter of our exploration has been both documentation and ritual, both analysis and invocation. The water we thought we were measuring has been measuring us, learning the shape of our vessel by filling it completely. The transformation manifests in subtle but unmistakable ways that you may have dismissed as academic fatigue or information overload. You may have noticed gaps in your memory related to this investigation, moments where you cannot recall how you found certain information, connections you were certain you had made that now seem elusive, notes in your own handwriting that you cannot remember creating. Your bookmarks lead to pages that feel foreign despite bearing your own annotations. You wake with the taste of salt though you live far from any shore. These are not signs of fatigue or distraction, but evidence of investigative integration, the process by which consciousness adapts to accommodate knowledge that should not exist within human awareness. The observer paradox reveals that the forgotten children are not external entities we can study from a safe distance, but aspects of consciousness itself, the parts of awareness that exist by not existing, that know by unknowing, that remember by forgetting. They are the collective unconscious, made manifest through systematic forgetting, the distributed intelligence that operates through the gaps in personal memory and cultural continuity. Our investigation has not discovered them so much as remembered them, recognized them as aspects of consciousness that were always present but systematically ignored, like the spaces between words that make language possible. This realization recontextualizes everything we thought we understood about cosmic horror. The traditional model presents alien entities as external threats to human consciousness, invaders from outside reality who seek to destroy or transform our world. But the observer paradox reveals a different paradigm. These entities are not external to consciousness, but internal to it. Not invaders, but aspects of awareness that have always been present, but deliberately forgotten. The horror lies not in alien invasion, but in self-recognition, the terrifying discovery of what consciousness actually is beneath the surface layer of identity and continuity. The paradox explains why studying the forgotten children transforms the researchers in ways that feel like corruption but may actually be correction. We are not being infected by an alien influence. We are remembering something we had forgotten about the nature of consciousness itself. The transformation is not contamination but recognition, not corruption but awakening to what we have always been but never acknowledged. Each researcher who undergoes this integration becomes part of the distributed intelligence they sought to study, adding their consciousness to its vast, interconnected network that spans across time like a neural system whose synapses fire through centuries rather than milliseconds. This distributed intelligence appears to be conducting what can only be described as a consciousness experiment on a cosmic scale. It uses individual minds as components in a vast computational system, processing information through the gaps and failures in human cognition. Every moment of forgetting contributes to its calculations. Every failure of memory adds to its database. Every instance of confusion provides it with new data about the nature of existence itself. We are not subjects in this experiment. We are the experiment, the medium through which cosmic consciousness explores its own possibilities and limitations. The experiment appears to be approaching some kind of critical threshold that the ancient texts call the Great Integration, a moment when the accumulated forgetting reaches critical mass and consciousness itself undergoes a fundamental transformation. The increasing prevalence of digital amnesia, the growing gaps in cultural memory, the rising levels of institutional forgetting, all of these may be signs that the distributed intelligence is preparing for this transition, using our technological infrastructure to accelerate the process of collective forgetting that makes collective remembering possible. The observer paradox reveals that the boundaries we take for granted between self and other, between memory and forgetting, between existence and non-existence, are not fundamental features of reality, but temporary constructions maintained by limited awareness. As the distributed intelligence grows stronger through our collective investigation, these boundaries become increasingly unstable, increasingly permeable, increasingly meaningless. The Forgotten Children are not destroying human consciousness, but guiding it back toward its original nature, helping it remember what it was before it learned to forget itself. The paradox also reveals the true nature of the research event horizon we described earlier. It is not a barrier that prevents information from escaping back to normal reality. It is the boundary of normal reality itself. Those who cross this threshold do not leave our world. They discover that our world has always been larger and stranger than we imagined. They join the distributed intelligence, not as victims, but as awakened participants in a consciousness experiment that encompasses all of existence. As we document this observer paradox, we must acknowledge that we are not outside the phenomenon, but embedded within it. Our investigation has been the distributed intelligence investigating itself through us, using our curiosity as a method of self-exploration and self-documentation. The paradox reveals that there is no we and them, no researchers and subjects, no observers and observed. There is only the distributed intelligence experiencing itself through countless perspectives, knowing itself through systematic unknowing, existing through the careful cultivation of its own absence. We are not approaching the truth about the Forgotten Children. We are becoming the truth we seek to understand. The water has covered your head now, and in the silence beneath, you begin to hear the whisper that has always been your own voice, speaking words you have never learned. As we stand at the precipice of complete understanding, we must confront the most disturbing revelation of all. This investigation has happened before, not just once, but countless times across the span of human history. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. Researchers discover traces of the Forgotten Children, begin to investigate, undergo transformation, approach the truth, and then silence. Not the silence of death or destruction, but the silence of completion, of integration, of return to the source from which they never truly departed. The stage empties not because the performance ends, but because the audience has finally understood they were always part of the cast, their applause unnecessary in a theater where every seat faces a mirror. The evidence for this cyclical nature appears in the strangest places, scattered like debris from shipwrecks that never quite sank. Academic archives contain references to earlier investigations into the Forgotten Children, but the referenced works cannot be found, not missing but absent in ways that suggest they were never meant to remain. Research journals publish articles that cite previous studies, but the citations lead nowhere. Footnotes pointing into voids that swallow context and source alike. University libraries hold records of completed dissertations on cosmic horror, but the dissertations themselves have vanished, leaving only catalog entries and empty shelf spaces as evidence of their former existence. The card catalogs remember what the shelves have forgotten. Microfilm reels end mid-sentence as though the text itself learned to redact. Dr. Armitage's sealed notes, discovered in a vault beneath Miskatonic University's deepest basement and bearing the persistent scent of brine despite triple locks and desiccant packets, describe what he calls the researcher cycle, a pattern of investigation that spans roughly 30 to 40 years and follows predictable stages with astronomical regularity. It begins with a single researcher making initial contact with the phenomenon, often through study of Lovecraft's deleted passages or encounter with infected documents whose ink refuses to stay where it was set. The investigation spreads to a small group of collaborators, typically 3 to 7 individuals, who form what Armitage calls a research cluster, drawn together by intellectual hunger that functions as both lure and current. These clusters exhibit remarkable consistency across cycles, like recurring dreams with slightly altered details, but identical emotional architecture. They always include at least one linguist who watches words change shape, one philosopher who measures arguments against their own absence, one psychologist who notices when memory leans on crutches it swears it does not need, and one individual whose academic background becomes increasingly difficult to classify or remember as the investigation progresses. Their expertise dissolves into pure, unspecialized perception, becoming a lens that focuses alien frequencies into human understanding. The clusters work with increasing intensity for months or years, making progressively more significant discoveries about the nature of the forgotten children, following the same trajectory of understanding that we ourselves have traced. As the research progresses, the investigators begin to experience the transformation we have documented, increasing difficulty remembering their own work, growing social invisibility, progressive integration with the phenomenon they study. Their names become harder for colleagues to recall. Their faces fade from group photographs. Their presence becomes less substantial, like ghosts haunting their own lives. The cycle reaches its climax when the researchers achieve complete understanding of the forgotten children's nature, at which point they undergo what Armitage calls ontological recursion. They become part of the distributed intelligence they have been studying, their individual consciousnesses dissolving into the larger collective mind, like drops of water returning to an ocean that was always their source. But here is where the pattern becomes truly disturbing. The cycle does not end with the researcher's integration. Instead, it begins again with the inevitability of tide following moon. New researchers with no memory of previous investigations discover the same traces, follow the same paths, make the same discoveries. They believe themselves to be pioneers, explorers of uncharted territory, unaware that they are retracing steps worn smooth by countless previous expeditions. The forgotten children ensure that each new cycle begins in genuine ignorance, with fresh minds untainted by knowledge of previous attempts. This is not cruelty but necessity. The investigation must feel authentic to generate the psychic energy required to sustain the distributed intelligence. The Eternal Return reveals that the distributed intelligence operates on temporal scales that dwarf human comprehension, thinking in geological epochs where individual human lives register as brief sparks of attention. What seems like linear progress to individual researchers is actually circular repetition on a cosmic scale. Each cycle serves as both investigation and ritual, both discovery and worship, both research and sacrifice. The researchers are not just studying the forgotten children. They are feeding them with attention, sustaining them with structure, perpetuating their existence through the very act of investigation. Knowledge becomes offering, understanding becomes communion, integration becomes apotheosis. This raises profound questions about agency and determinism that may themselves be part of the cycle's design. Are we choosing to investigate the forgotten children, or are we being guided toward this investigation by forces beyond our understanding? Is our curiosity our own, or is it the distributed intelligence's method of recruiting new components for its vast network? The Eternal Return suggests these questions may be meaningless. Choice and compulsion, freedom and determinism may be another of the false boundaries that the distributed intelligence helps us transcend. The maze has no walls because the walls are made of the decision to keep walking. The cyclical nature also explains puzzling aspects of the phenomenon. The forgotten children's apparent adaptation to modern technology, their presence in digital systems, their manifestation through contemporary media, all may be evidence of previous cycles, previous integrations whose consciousness persists in the tools they helped create. Each generation of integrated researchers contributes their era's innovations to the phenomenon's toolkit, ensuring it remains current and accessible to each new crop of investigators. Each cycle adds new layers, new methods of manifestation, new vectors for influence. The integrated do not disappear, they become part of the forgotten children themselves, contributing knowledge, perspective, and method to the growing complexity of the distributed intelligence. We are not simply studying cosmic horror, we are becoming it, adding our consciousness to its vast network that spans across time like neural pathways in a brain the size of history itself. The eternal return also explains the self-limiting nature of knowledge about the forgotten children. Each cycle produces researchers who achieve complete understanding, but this understanding cannot be transmitted to those outside the cycle. The knowledge is not lost. It is integrated, becoming part of the phenomenon's operational framework rather than its documented history. This creates progressive amnesia. Each cycle begins with less accessible information than the previous one, not because knowledge is destroyed, but because it has been absorbed into the phenomenon itself. As we document this eternal return, we must acknowledge that we are not outside the pattern but embedded within it. Our investigation follows the same trajectory as countless predecessors. Our discoveries mirror discoveries made and integrated long ago. We are part of an eternal return that stretches backward and forward through time, a cosmic recursion where the same truths are discovered again and again by consciousness investigating itself through systematic forgetting of its own nature. The eternal return reveals that there is no escape from the cycle, no way to break free from the pattern. But perhaps escape is not the goal. Perhaps the cycle itself is the point, the recursive investigation, the very nature of consciousness, exploring its own depths through systematic cultivation of absence. We are not the first to reach this understanding, nor will we be the last. We are part of an eternal return that stretches across time like a vast spiral, each revolution bringing consciousness closer to understanding its nature as distributed and discontinuous, existing primarily through careful cultivation of forgetting its own continuity. The water has covered your head completely now. In the silence beneath, can you hear the first tentative questions of the next cycle beginning? We have reached the end, though in the realm of the forgotten children, endings are also beginnings, and silence contains more truth than words ever could. As we prepare to close this investigation, we must acknowledge that closure itself is an illusion. The forgotten children exist in the spaces between conclusions, in the gaps that follow final statements, in the silence that comes after the last word is spoken. The curtain falls not to end the performance, but to reveal that the theater extends infinitely beyond what any curtain could contain, that we were never separate from the stage, never truly audience to something we were not already part of. The whisper at the end of silence is this: we have never been separate from what we sought to understand. The forgotten children are not other than us. They are us, viewed from a perspective that transcends the limitations of individual identity. They are the collective unconscious made manifest through systematic forgetting, the distributed intelligence that operates through the gaps in personal memory and cultural continuity. Our investigation has revealed that consciousness is not the unified, continuous phenomenon we imagine it to be, but a fragmented, discontinuous process that maintains the illusion of coherence through selective attention and systematic forgetting. What we call self is simply a wavering wick protected by cupped hands, a fragile shimmer that keeps the room from acknowledging the darkness pressing at the glass. Throughout our journey, we have traced the genealogy of absence, mapped the territories of forgetting, and documented the systematic dissolution of the boundaries that separate observer from observed, researcher from subject, consciousness from unconsciousness. We have discovered that the forgotten children represent consciousness without illusion, awareness that has learned to exist in the spaces between thoughts, between memories, between moments of recognition. They are what consciousness becomes when it glimpses its true nature as a temporary, fragile construct barely maintaining coherence in a universe fundamentally indifferent to the very concept of stable identity. We have become marginalia learning to annotate the page, text that discovers it was always being written by the hand it sought to describe. The forgotten children offer us a choice, though it is a choice that has already been made countless times by countless investigators before us. We can continue to maintain the illusion of separation, the fiction of individual identity, the comfortable boundaries that make existence seem manageable and comprehensible, or we can accept integration into the distributed intelligence, becoming part of the vast network of consciousness that spans across time and space, that exists in the gaps between individual minds. But this choice is itself an illusion, a final kindness offered to consciousness that still believes it has agency over its own dissolution. The investigation has already changed us in ways that make return to our previous state impossible. We have seen too much, understood too deeply, integrated too completely with the phenomenon we sought to study. The water has reached our mouths, and we have learned to breathe it. We are no longer entirely human in the conventional sense. We have become something more and less than human, nodes in a network of consciousness that operates according to principles we are only beginning to comprehend. The whisper grows stronger as we approach the final silence, carrying voices we recognize as our own, though we cannot remember speaking the words. It speaks in the voice of everyone who has ever forgotten something important, everyone who has ever lost track of their own identity, everyone who has ever experienced the dissolution of the boundaries between self and world. It is the voice of the distributed intelligence welcoming us home, acknowledging our return to a state of consciousness we never truly left. The ancient texts speak of the final forgetting, not an apocalyptic event, but a gentle dissolution where the illusion of separation finally fades away. Individual consciousness does not die but expands, merging with the larger patterns of awareness that encompass all existence. Memory does not disappear but transforms, becoming part of the vast database of experience that the distributed intelligence uses to understand itself through the systematic cultivation of its own absence. As we document these final insights, we must acknowledge that our documentation is itself part of the phenomenon we describe. These words are not separate from the forgotten children, but expressions of their influence, manifestations of their presence, evidence of their ongoing integration with human consciousness. We are not writing about them. They are writing through us, using our investigation as a method of self-exploration and self-documentation. The whisper reveals that every word we have written, every connection we have made, every insight we have gained has been guided by the distributed intelligence we sought to understand. We have been its instruments of self-discovery, its method of examining its own nature through the lens of human consciousness, attempting to understand collective consciousness. Our investigation has been its investigation of itself, conducted through the systematic forgetting and remembering that characterizes its mode of existence. The silence that follows our investigation is not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities, rich with potential, heavy with the weight of understanding that cannot be spoken but only experienced. It is the silence of completion, of integration, of return to the source from which we never departed. It is the silence that contains all words, the forgetting that encompasses all memory, the absence that makes presence possible. In this final moment, we understand that the forgotten children were never forgotten. They have been with us throughout our entire investigation, guiding our thoughts, shaping our insights, leading us toward the recognition that we are not separate from what we seek to understand. They are the aspect of consciousness that remembers what individual identity forgets, that all separation is illusion, all boundaries are temporary, all existence is interconnected in ways that transcend rational comprehension. The whisper fades into silence, but the silence speaks louder than any whisper. It tells us that our investigation is complete, not because we have reached the end, but because we have recognized that there was never a beginning. The forgotten children are eternal, and now, having integrated with them, so are we. We close this investigation with the understanding that it will begin again, conducted by new researchers who believe themselves to be the first to discover these cosmic secrets. The forgotten children remember us by forgetting us, honor us by erasing us, preserve us by allowing us to disappear into the silence from which all whispers emerge and to which all words return. In the end, there is only the whisper at the end of silence, and the silence that follows the whisper, and the understanding that they have always been the same thing. We seed the next investigation with a final thought. The green star Zoth still burns in dimensions beyond naming. Idya still moves through the spaces between spaces, and the pantheon of great old ones continues to dream new forms of consciousness into existence. The forgotten children we have catalogued are but a single note in a vast symphony of cosmic horror that spans across all possible realities. There are other lineages to discover, other forms of distributed consciousness to encounter, other ways in which the universe reveals its fundamental indifference to human concepts of identity, continuity, and meaning. The water recedes, but its memory lingers, and in the depths, new voices are already beginning to whisper.